Welcome to this journey of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history of Natchez, Mississippi. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. The warmth of the Mississippi summer clung to everything it touched in Adams County back in 1844. Between the grand mansions that lined the bluffs overlooking the great river and the dense forests that surrounded them, something unspeakable occurred at Elmwood Estate, a once prominent plantation just outside of Natchez. County records from that year mention a death, one that raised no suspicions initially: the passing of Harold Caldwell, a wealthy landowner whose appetites were well known throughout the region. What those records fail to mention is the true nature of his demise. It wasn't until 1962 when a historian named Dr. Marcus Winters discovered a collection of household ledgers, personal correspondence, and a journal written by a local physician that the disturbing truth began to surface. These documents were found in the basement of the Adams County Courthouse, misfiled and forgotten for over a century. The journal entries describe a macabre transformation that took place over 14 months. They speak of a man whose body became his prison, whose appetite became his undoing, and whose household servant orchestrated what may be one of the most methodical acts of revenge ever documented in antebellum Mississippi. The documents disappeared shortly after Dr. Winters began his research. Some claim they were destroyed in a small fire that damaged part of the courthouse archives in 1964. Others suggest they were deliberately removed to protect certain family names that remain prominent in the region. What follows is based on Dr. Winters's notes and the testimonies he gathered before his sudden abandonment of the project in 1965. In the oppressive summer heat of Natchez, Mississippi, 1844, where even the air seemed to slow down, Harold Caldwell's final chapter began with the arrival of a housemaid who would change everything. The Caldwell plantation stood 3 miles east of Natchez, along the old Kingston Road. The main house, with its imposing white columns and wraparound veranda, commanded views of cultivated fields and the distant curve of the Mississippi River. Harold Caldwell was, by all accounts, a man of substantial means and equally substantial frame. At 45 years of age, the widower had already developed a reputation for indulgence. Estate inventory records describe a wine cellar with bottles from France and Spain, imported furnishings, and ledgers documenting lavish entertaining. The community knew him as a harsh master, but a generous host. His wife, Elizabeth, had passed 5 years earlier from fever, leaving him to manage the estate and his growing collections of art, furniture, and grievances. According to household accounts, it was on June 17, 1844, that Delilah Moore arrived at Elmwood. She came with references from a family in New Orleans that had recently returned north. The daughter of a freeman from Saint-Domingue and a mother whose origin remained unrecorded, Delilah possessed cooking skills that were immediately noticed. Estate records indicate she was assigned to kitchen duties within 3 days of her arrival. "Mr. Caldwell seems quite pleased with the new cook," wrote Thomas Hadley, the estate overseer, in his weekly report. "He has taken dinner in the main house every night this week, rather than at his club in town." What the reports don't mention is the deliberate calculation behind every dish that emerged from that kitchen. The plantation ledgers, discovered a century later, show a curious increase in certain food orders: unusual spices, excessive butter, cream, and sugar, far beyond the typical amounts used in Southern cooking of the period. Neighbor Margaret Wilkerson noted in a letter to her sister in Virginia, "Harold appears to have developed quite an attachment to his home in recent months. We see him less at social gatherings, though he sends regrets with claims of business matters. When I called last Tuesday, I hardly recognized him. He has become quite robust, even for a man who was never slight to begin with." The transformation of Harold Caldwell had begun, but no one recognized the pattern taking shape. The The plantation continued its operations, producing cotton and maintaining the appearance of normality, while inside the main house, a different kind of cultivation was underway. Dr. James Merriweather, the family physician, noted in his private journal, part of the documents discovered in 1962, his growing concern. Called to Elmwood today at Caldwell's request, he complains of shortness of breath and swelling in his lower extremities. His girth has increased significantly since my visit in spring. When I suggested moderation in diet, he became agitated and dismissed my concerns. His cook served us a dessert of remarkable richness during my visit, a custard with French liqueur that Caldwell consumed with notable enthusiasm. The cook watched him eat with an intensity I found curious. By autumn of 1844, Harold Caldwell was declining invitations to events he would never have missed in previous years. The once social plantation owner was slowly retreating from public life, creating a vacuum that would later make his demise less noticeable to the outside world. The isolation was not by chance. Household accounts show that during this period, Delilah began to gradually dismiss or reassign longer-serving house staff, first the butler, then the housekeeper. Both replaced by individuals Delilah recommended, people with no previous connection to Caldwell. By December, almost all those who had served in the main house during Elizabeth Caldwell's lifetime were gone. "The changes at Elmwood have been most dramatic," wrote Reverend Simmons in a letter to a colleague. "Upon calling to discuss the Christmas charity, I found the house much altered. New draperies block much of the light, and there is an atmosphere of heaviness I cannot quite describe. Caldwell himself has changed as well. He received me from a large chair specially built to accommodate his expanded frame, and seemed short of breath throughout our brief conversation. The new housekeeper hovered nearby, seemingly reluctant to leave us unattended. I left with an unsettled feeling I cannot adequately explain. What Reverend Simmons could not have known was that the heaviness he perceived was not merely in the atmosphere. According to Dr. Merriweather's journal, Harold Caldwell had gained an estimated 70 pounds in 6 months, a transformation that modern medicine would recognize as dangerously rapid. "I find myself drawn to the table with an urgency I cannot explain," Caldwell wrote in a letter to his brother in Baltimore, discovered among the 1962 documents. "Delilah's cooking satisfies something in me that I never knew was empty. I think often of Elizabeth and how she would hardly recognize the man I've become, and yet I cannot seem to moderate my appetite. It is as though I am consuming to fill a void that grows larger with each passing day." As winter settled over Natchez, the transformation continued behind the increasingly private walls of Elmwood. The community noticed Harold Caldwell's absence, but few suspected the true nature of what was happening within the plantation house. The isolation served a purpose that would only become clear as the seasons changed and the carefully orchestrated plan progressed to its next phase. By the early months of 1845, the once active Harold Caldwell rarely left his bedroom on the second floor of Elmwood. Delilah had moved her sleeping quarters to a small room adjacent to the master suite, to better attend to the master's needs at all hours, according to Thomas Hadley's increasingly infrequent reports. The plantation continued to function under Hadley's supervision, while the main house became a world unto itself, governed by new rhythms and rules established not by its owner, but by the woman who had become indispensable to him. Dr. Merriweather's journal entries from February 1845 reveal growing alarm. Caldwell's condition deteriorates weekly. His breathing is labored even at rest, and his limbs show concerning edema. When I attempt to discuss the clear connection between his diet and his symptoms, he becomes defensive, even hostile. More troubling is the behavior of his housemaid, Delilah. She interjects during our consultations, challenges my recommendations, and has twice suggested alternative remedies that would, in my professional opinion, exacerbate rather than alleviate his symptoms. I find myself wondering if she possesses the medical knowledge to understand the harm she causes, or if her interference stems from mere ignorance. What the good doctor could not bring himself to write, even in his private journal, was the possibility that the harm was intentional, the possibility that each rich sauce, each sweetened dish, each second and third portion was calculated to hasten Caldwell toward a specific end. A letter from Margaret Wilkerson to her sister, dated March 1845, offers a rare glimpse inside Elmwood during this period. I finally gained entry to Elmwood yesterday after 3 previous attempts were rebuffed with claims that Harold was resting or indisposed. What I found inside has disturbed my sleep ever since. The house has a peculiar odor, a mixture of rich food, medicinal tonics, and something underlying that I cannot name, but found instantly repellent. Harold himself has become nearly unrecognizable. Seated in what appeared to be a specially constructed chair, he filled the space entirely. His face, once angular and often severe, has become round to the point of distortion. His breathing was labored throughout our brief conversation, and a sheen of perspiration covered his features despite the cool temperature of the room. Most unsettling was the presence of his housemaid, who never left his side. She served him continuous small portions of confections throughout my visit, which he consumed with an almost mechanical regularity. When I commented on the quantity, suggesting perhaps some restraint might benefit his clearly failing health, the look that passed between them sent a chill through me. Harold's eyes showed something like fear, quickly masked by irritation, while the woman's expression remained impassive except for the slightest curve of satisfaction at the corner of her mouth. I left shortly afterward, unable to bear the oppressive atmosphere any longer. The plantation ledgers from this period show significant changes in the household expenses. Orders for regular staples decreased, while purchases of sugar, butter, cream, and certain spices increased dramatically. There were also new entries, specialized medicinal tonics ordered from New Orleans, payments to a cabinet maker for custom furniture pieces, and multiple deliveries from a seamstress for modified clothing. The transformation of Harold Caldwell from a commanding, active plantation owner to a housebound, immobilized shadow of himself was well underway, yet few outside Elmwood's walls fully comprehended what was happening. The community noticed his absence from church services and social events, but accepted the various excuses offered by the household staff. In the hierarchical society of antebellum Natchez, it was unthinkable that a house servant could orchestrate the slow destruction of her master, and so no one thought it. As spring arrived in Mississippi, bringing with it the heavy scent of magnolias and the first uncomfortable humidity of the approaching summer, Harold Caldwell became effectively imprisoned in his own body. Dr. Meriwether's journal describes a man unable to descend the stairs, reliant on others for the most basic functions, and yet still consuming enormous quantities of rich food prepared by the ever-present Delilah. A particularly disturbing entry from April 1845 reads, "I arrived at Elmwood today to find Caldwell in acute respiratory distress. His ankles and legs are severely edematous, and I suspect his heart is failing under the strain of supporting his greatly increased mass. When I insisted on a drastic change in diet as the only way to possibly reverse his decline, the housemaid Delilah interrupted, informing me that she had prepared a special custard to strengthen the master's constitution. Before I could object, she fed him a spoonful, which he accepted with the automatic compliance I've observed developing in recent months. I left a tonic to reduce the fluid retention, but have little hope it will be administered as directed. I fear Caldwell will not survive the summer if his current conditions persist. What Dr. Meriwether could not have known, or perhaps suspected but could not bring himself to document, was that survival was not part of Delilah's plan for Harold Caldwell. A curious document discovered among the 1962 findings was a small notebook, apparently belonging to Delilah Moore, containing what appeared to be personal observations written in a mixture of English and Creole French. One entry, dated approximately to early 1845, reads, "The master speaks often of hunger, that never ceases. He does not understand that hunger is memory. My people know hunger that spans generations. His hunger spans only from one meal to the next, yet he speaks as though he suffers a great burden. Soon he will understand true burden, the weight of his own flesh becoming the chains he cannot break. This rare glimpse into Delilah's mindset suggests a motivation beyond mere opportunism or petty revenge. The reference to generational hunger points to a deeper historical consciousness, a recognition of the systemic injustices that define the antebellum South. In this context, Harold Caldwell becomes not merely an individual target, but a symbol of a broader system. His physical transformation, a grotesque reflection of the moral corruption that underpinned the plantation economy. As May turned to June, almost exactly a year after Delilah's arrival at Elmwood, the carefully orchestrated final act began to unfold. The plantation ledgers show a curious entry on June 10, 1845. Payment to Mr. Finch, cabinet maker, for one custom bed frame, reinforced. It would be the last piece of specialized furniture ordered for Harold Caldwell. According to the fragmentary records that survived, the next week brought a change in the household routine. Delilah began sending away the few remaining servants from the main house for increasingly extended periods. The cook's assistant was dispatched to Natchez for special ingredients. The temporary butler was given 3 days' leave to attend to a supposedly ill relative. The upstairs maid was reassigned to help in the laundry facility far from the main house. By June 17, 1845, exactly 1 year after Delilah's arrival, only she and Harold Caldwell remained in the main house of Elmwood Plantation. What transpired over the next 3 days would remain largely unknown until Dr. Winter's discoveries in 1962, and even those accounts are incomplete and subject to interpretation. What is known with certainty from county death records is that Harold Caldwell died on June 20, 1845. The official cause listed was apoplexy, what we would now recognize as a stroke or heart failure. Given his condition as described in Dr. Meriwether's journal, this would have seemed an unremarkable, even expected conclusion. But the journal contains one final entry related to Harold Caldwell, dated June 21, 1845, called to Elmwood upon notification of Caldwell's death. Found the body in an advanced state considering the reported time of death. Most disturbing were the conditions of the bedchamber. The specially made bed held a deep impression, and the sheets, though changed, showed evidence of having been soaked through. A peculiar sweet metallic odor permeated the room despite windows having been opened. When I inquired about Caldwell's final hours, the housemaid Delilah provided a detailed account of his declining condition, speaking with a clinical detachment I found inappropriate. She produced a final meal she claimed to have prepared for him, a thin broth she described as cleansing, though I saw no evidence it had been consumed. When I suggested an examination might be appropriate given the circumstances, she produced a document, apparently signed by Caldwell weeks earlier, expressly forbidding post-mortem examination for any reason. I noted the signature appeared shaky but consistent with his hand in recent months. As his physician, I had no grounds to override his documented wishes. The journal entry concludes with an observation that would take on sinister significance when viewed alongside other documents discovered in 1962. As I was leaving, I passed the kitchen and observed an unusual number of empty spice containers set aside for disposal. Among them I recognized labels for several substances that, in sufficient quantities, could produce symptoms not unlike those of natural organ failure. I cannot bring myself to pursue this observation further, as it suggests possibilities too monstrous to contemplate in a civilized society. Dr. Meriwether never publicly voiced his suspicions. His journal shows he left Natchez later that year, relocating to St. Louis, where he had family connections. Whether his departure was related to the events at Elmwood remains a matter of conjecture. In the days following Harold Caldwell's death, Elmwood experienced a swift transition of power. According to estate records, Delilah Moore presented documents to Thomas Hadley, the overseer, indicating that Caldwell had granted her freedom and a modest payment for her services. The documents, while unusual, appeared to be properly executed and witnessed. No one thought to question when or how these documents had been prepared or under what circumstances they had been signed. Delilah departed Elmwood on June 25, 1845, just 5 days after Caldwell's death. Plantation records indicate she traveled to New Orleans, but no further trace of her has ever been confirmed. The modest payment she received, $150 according to estate settlement documents, would have provided enough for passage elsewhere, perhaps back to the Caribbean or even to a northern state. Harold Caldwell's body was interred in the family plot on the Elmwood grounds, with a simple service attended by business associates rather than friends, a telling detail about the man's life and relationships. With no direct heirs, the estate passed to his brother from Baltimore, who promptly listed it for sale. Elmwood changed hands by the end of 1845, and the new owners reportedly made significant changes to the main house, including the complete renovation of the master suite and kitchen. The story of Harold Caldwell and Delilah Moore might have remained just another forgotten footnote in Adams County history, were it not for Dr. Marcus Winter's discovery in 1962. Among the documents he found was a small leather-bound notebook, its pages filled with a tight, precise handwriting. The entries were undated, but appeared to have been written over time. They contained recipes, detailed instructions for dishes featuring rich sauces, unusual spice combinations, and preparations designed to disguise certain flavors while enhancing others. Interspersed among these recipes were brief, cryptic notes. The effect increases with regular consumption, read one. Small amounts produce dependence, larger amounts produce compliance, stated another. Perhaps most disturbing was an entry that simply read, "When the body becomes the prison, the appetite becomes the jailer." Linguistic analysis performed on the notebook in 1963 suggested it was written by someone educated in French and English, with occasional syntax patterns consistent with Creole influence from Saint-Domingue, modern Haiti. While never conclusively proven to belong to Delilah Moore, the circumstantial evidence is compelling. The final pages of the notebook contained what appeared to be a personal statement, written in a more hurried hand than the meticulous recipes. They think ownership flows one way, from master to slave, from man to woman. They do not understand that to own someone's hunger is to own their soul. To control what passes their lips is to control what passes their mind. He owned my body for 1 year. I owned his appetite, and through it, everything he thought he possessed. The scales now balance. A separate document found alongside the notebook contained what appeared to be a methodical record of Harold Caldwell's transformation. It listed weekly measurements of his expanding waistline, notes on his declining mobility, and observations about his increasing dependence on assistance for basic functions. The clinical precision of these records suggests a calculated approach to Caldwell's deterioration, one that treated his body as an experiment rather than a living person. Perhaps most disturbing was a section titled simply "The Process," which outlined what appears to be a systematic method for creating physical and psychological dependency through food. It described in detached, almost scientific language the stages of transformation, initial indulgence, developing cravings, increasing portion sizes, introducing addictive substances, creating isolation, establishing complete dependency, and finally, what was termed the culmination, a phase described only as when the prison of flesh becomes the tomb. Dr. Winter's research was never published. His notes indicate he intended to produce a scholarly article on what he termed a case of inverted power dynamics in antebellum Mississippi. However, according to colleagues, he abandoned the project in early 1965 after receiving several anonymous letters that he described as concerning. The documents he discovered were reportedly returned to the county archives, where they were supposedly destroyed in the previously mentioned small fire in 1964. Whether this destruction was accidental or deliberate remains an open question. Several prominent Natchez families of the 1960s could trace their lineage to individuals connected with Elmwood Plantation, and the implications of Dr. Winter's research might have proven unwelcome in the socially conservative Mississippi of that era. The site where Elmwood once stood is now part of a modern housing development. The family cemetery was relocated in the 1970s during construction, and Harold Caldwell's remains now rest in the Natchez City Cemetery, marked by a simple stone that gives only his name and dates, with no indication of the extraordinary circumstances of his demise. What remains of this disturbing chapter in Mississippi history is a fragmented collection of documents, journal entries, and letters that together suggest a calculated act of revenge carried out with methodical precision through the most intimate of daily rituals, the preparation and consumption of food. The story of Delilah Moore and Harold Caldwell serves as a dark reminder of how power can shift in unexpected ways, how intimacy can become a weapon, and how the most ordinary aspects of daily life, the meals we consume, the people who prepare them, the rituals of the table, can become vessels for both sustenance and destruction. A curious footnote to the Elmwood story emerged in 1966, when a professor of culinary history at Tulane University received an anonymous package containing what appeared to be handwritten recipes dating from the mid-19th century. The recipes, written in the same distinctive hand as the notebook found by Dr. Winters, detailed dishes that combined traditional Creole techniques with unusual ingredients known in traditional Caribbean medicine for their effects on appetite and metabolism. The professor, Dr. Eleanor Richards, became fascinated by these recipes, not realizing their connection to the Elmwood case. She attempted to trace their origin, publishing a small article in a culinary history journal titled Cuisine as Control, Appetite, Manipulation in Antebellum Southern Cooking. Shortly after publication, Dr. Richards reported receiving strange packages containing spoiled food and notes warning her to stop digging where bones lie. She abandoned her research and reportedly destroyed the recipes, later describing them as instructions for a type of gastronomic manipulation that crosses the boundary into something darker than mere cooking. In the years following Harold Caldwell's death, Elmwood Plantation changed hands several times. Each new owner reported unusual occurrences in the main house, particularly in the kitchen and master bedroom. According to local accounts collected by Dr. Winters, servants refused to work late hours in the kitchen, claiming to hear the rhythmic sound of a knife on a cutting board when no one was there. Several families reported unexplained sensations of hunger that would wake them in the night, driving them to the kitchen despite having eaten full meals before retiring. Perhaps most disturbing were reports from the 1890s, when the then owners, the Bradford family, discovered a hidden space between the pantry and kitchen walls. Inside was a collection of small bottles, their labels faded but still legible enough to identify several compounds known to stimulate appetite and others recognized as slow-acting toxins when consumed in small amounts over time. Alongside these bottles was a small leather pouch containing a folded paper. According to family accounts, the paper held a list of names, 13 in total, with all but one crossed out. The name Harold Caldwell was the last on the list, marked through with a decisive line. The other names have never been publicly identified, though local speculation suggested they may have been previous employers who suffered similar fates at Delilah's hands. The Bradford family reportedly burned the list and disposed of the bottles, considering them macabre reminders of the house's history. They sold Elmwood within the year. In 1910, during renovations to the kitchen at Elmwood, workers discovered a small chamber beneath the floorboards, a space just large enough for a person to sit upright, accessed by a cleverly disguised trapdoor. Inside were found a small cot several empty water jugs, and a journal written in Creole French. The journal was apparently delivered to the property owner, James Whitfield, who, according to his grandson's later account, became increasingly paranoid about his food after reading it. Whitfield reportedly fired his entire kitchen staff and insisted on preparing all his own meals until his death in 1917. The journal itself disappeared, but Whitfield's grandson recalled his grandfather describing it as the confession of a demon who wore a woman's form. According to this second-hand account, the journal detailed how its author, presumably Delilah Moore, had used the hidden space beneath the kitchen as a retreat where she could record her observations and mix the compounds she added to Harold Caldwell's food. Most chilling were the reported descriptions of Caldwell's final days, which Whitfield found too disturbing to relate in detail to his family. He would only say that the journal described a final feast that lasted 3 days, during which Caldwell was fed continuously, unable to refuse or resist, his body becoming the instrument of his own destruction. The final documented account of strange occurrences at Elmwood comes from 1927, shortly before the property was abandoned during the economic hardships that preceded the Great Depression. The owner, William Garson, described in a letter to his sister a disturbing experience. "I was awakened last night by what I can only describe as the sensation of being fed. Half asleep, I felt a spoon pressed to my lips and instinctively opened my mouth. The taste was extraordinarily rich, like nothing served in this house in recent memory, and filled me with an unexpected satisfaction. Only as I became fully awake did I realize I was alone in the room, the taste still lingering on my tongue. I leave for Memphis tomorrow and do not intend to return." Elmwood stood empty for nearly 2 decades after Garson's departure. The main house fell into disrepair and was finally demolished in the early 1950s. When the property was developed for housing in the 1970s, construction workers reported finding numerous small animal skeletons buried in what had once been the kitchen garden, each skeleton curiously misshapen, as though the animals had been deliberately overfed before their deaths. Dr. Winter's final notes, never formally published but shared with a colleague shortly before he abandoned his research, suggest a theory about Delilah Moore that extends beyond her time at Elmwood. He believed she may have been connected to a tradition of poisoners documented in Saint-Domingue and later Haiti, women who used their knowledge of herbs, spices, and toxic substances as weapons against those who held power over them. "The method employed at Elmwood," he wrote, "represents an evolution of this tradition, not a single fatal dose, but a prolonged campaign that weaponized the victim's own appetites against him. The psychological components are particularly disturbing: the creation of dependence, the isolation from potential interventions, the gradual assumption of control over the victim's environment, and finally, the complete reversal of the established power dynamic. In the end, Caldwell, despite his legal and social authority, became entirely dependent on the woman society deemed his inferior. His body, transformed by her careful manipulations, became first his prison and ultimately his tomb." Dr. Winter's colleague reported that after writing these observations, Winters received the first of several anonymous letters that prompted him to abandon the research. The content of these letters has never been revealed, but they apparently disturbed him enough to destroy many of his notes and return the original documents to the county archives. Before departing Natchez, Dr. Winters left one final note with his colleague. "Some histories are not meant to be fully uncovered. I have looked too deeply into this one and found myself being watched in return. The methods documented in those recipes do not belong in academic discourse, or perhaps in any discourse at all. Some knowledge should remain buried, like Caldwell himself, silent beneath the soil of Mississippi." Local historian and folklorist Amelia Porter, who investigated the Elmwood case in the 1980s after hearing about Dr. Winters's abandoned research, offered perhaps the most chilling observation. "What makes this case so disturbing is not just the method of murder, if indeed it was murder, rather than an elaborate form of assisted suicide brought on by Caldwell's own appetites. What truly unsettles is the intimacy of it. Every bite Caldwell took was an act of communion with his own destruction. Every meal was both nourishment and poison, and every day the woman preparing those meals watched him consume his own doom with pleasure and gratitude. Porter's research led her to trace shipping records from New Orleans in the months following Caldwell's death. She discovered a passenger matching Delilah Moore's description, who booked passage to Charleston on June 30th, 1845. From there, the trail grows cold. Though Porter uncovered rumors of a woman fitting similar descriptions working as a cook for prominent families in Savannah, Richmond, and finally Baltimore through the 1850s. In each location, at least one unexplained death of a wealthy individual was recorded, typically attributed to natural causes, but characterized by similar patterns of physical decline. If these connections are more than coincidence, Porter wrote in her unpublished manuscript, then Delilah Moore may represent one of the most successful serial killers in American history, one who operated not through violence, but through the intimate act of feeding. Her weapons were not guns or knives, but butter, sugar, and spice, and her methodology was so aligned with the expected social roles of women, particularly women of color in the antebellum South, that it remained effectively invisible to those who might have otherwise detected it. Porter's manuscript, like Dr. Winter's research before it, remained unpublished. She reported receiving anonymous communications suggesting she leave old ghosts undisturbed, and chose to set the work aside. The manuscript was reportedly stored in the University of Mississippi archives, though attempts to locate it in recent years have been unsuccessful. A curious development occurred in 1992 when a graduate student researching food rituals in the Caribbean discovered a collection of letters in the archives of a historical society in Port-au-Prince, Haiti. The letters, written between 1835 and 1843, were correspondence between a woman in Saint-Domingue and her cousin who had relocated to New Orleans. The letters contained detailed discussions of traditional recipes, but with coded language that the student recognized as references to compounds with physiological effects. One letter, dated January 1843, made specific reference to a plan involving securing a position in the house of a man who deserves to be consumed by his own hungers. The letter concluded with the chilling statement, "Remember what our grandmother taught, to control the stomach is to control the soul. Feed them what they crave until they crave only what you feed them. Then feed them their own destruction, one sweet spoonful at a time." The student presented these findings at a small academic conference, but found little interest in what was dismissed as speculative connection to the obscure Elmwood case. However, shortly after returning to the United States, the student reported that his apartment had been broken into and his research notes stolen. No other items were taken. The student abandoned the research direction entirely. What remains of the Elmwood case today are fragments, disconnected pieces of a historical puzzle that suggests a narrative too disturbing for its time to fully acknowledge. The story challenges comfortable assumptions about power, control, and resistance in the antebellum South. It suggests that even within the brutally unequal power dynamics of that period, unexpected reversals were possible, that the most mundane aspects of daily life could become battlegrounds where the oppressed might claim victories invisible to the society that oppressed them. The housing development that now occupies the former grounds of Elmwood Plantation bears no historical marker, no indication of the events that transpired there in 1844, 1845. Residents occasionally report unusual dreams of endless feasts they cannot stop consuming, or mysterious scents of baking that seem to have no source. But these accounts are dismissed as neighborhood folklore, the kind of stories that attach themselves to any location with enough history behind it. The grave of Harold Caldwell remains in the Natchez City Cemetery, visited occasionally by history students or tourists with an interest in the darker corners of Mississippi's past. Some visitors report leaving the gravesite with an inexplicable hunger that persists for days afterward, a sensation that drives them to consume rich foods despite their better judgment. And somewhere, perhaps in an archive yet to be fully cataloged, or in a private collection passed down through generations, the full account of Delilah Moore and her methodical revenge may still exist, waiting for another researcher brave enough to piece together the complete narrative of the housemaid who fattened her master to death. Until such time, the story remains a whispered legend, a cautionary tale about the unexpected ways power can shift, and a reminder that history's most disturbing chapters are often written not in the grand events recorded in official narratives, but in the intimate spaces of daily life, at the table, in the kitchen, in the subtle relationship between those who serve and those who are served. In 2005, during the renovation of one of Natchez' oldest restaurants, a building that in the 1840s had housed a small grocery and dry goods store, workers discovered a hidden compartment behind a kitchen wall. Inside was a small wooden box containing several glass vials, their contents long since evaporated, and a folded piece of parchment with a recipe written in faded ink. The recipe, titled simply, "For Those Who Hunger Too Much," contained instructions for a sauce incorporating ingredients known to both stimulate appetite and, in sufficient quantities, cause digestive distress and fluid retention. The restaurant owner, fascinated by this historical curiosity, showed it to a local food historian who recognized similarities to recipes documented in Dr. Winter's fragmentary research notes. The historian suggested the recipe might be connected to the Elmwood case, but before further investigation could occur, the document mysteriously disappeared from the restaurant owner's office. When asked about it later, the owner seemed confused, claiming no memory of the box or its contents, despite multiple witnesses who had seen it. This pattern of discovery, followed by erasure, has characterized the Elmwood case throughout its history. Tantalizing fragments emerge only to disappear again, as though some force actively works to keep the full narrative buried. In 2010, a descendant of Thomas Hadley, the overseer at Elmwood during Delilah Moore's time there, donated a collection of family papers to the Mississippi Department of Archives and History. Among them was a journal kept by Hadley's wife, Sarah, which contained several entries related to the events at Elmwood. One particularly revealing entry, dated July 1845, shortly after Caldwell's death, reads, "Thomas returned from the main house today, greatly disturbed. He will not speak of what he saw when helping to prepare Mr. Caldwell's body for burial, saying only that no Christian man should have to look upon such a sight. He burned the clothes he wore that day and bathed 3 times before coming to bed. He refuses food I have not prepared with my own hands and watches me closely as I cook. When I asked what troubles him so, he said, 'Some hungers are not meant to be fed.' He will say nothing more on the matter." This entry suggests that Hadley may have witnessed evidence of Caldwell's true condition, perhaps indications that his death was neither natural nor peaceful. The overseer's subsequent paranoia about food prepared by others lends credence to the theory that he suspected or knew of Delilah's methods. Later entries in Sarah Hadley's journal suggest that Thomas was haunted by his knowledge long after Caldwell's death. In October 1845, she wrote, "Thomas wakes shouting in the night, speaking of feasts that never end and hunger that cannot be satisfied. He has lost considerable weight, refusing most food except plain bread and water. When I press him to eat properly, he grows agitated and says, 'You cannot understand what I've seen, what becomes of a man when appetite becomes his master.'" The journal indicates that Thomas Hadley never fully recovered from whatever he witnessed at Elmwood, his health gradually declining until his premature death in 1868. Another significant document emerged in 1969 when renovations to the Adams County Courthouse uncovered a sealed envelope behind a loose brick in the basement wall. Inside was a single sheet of paper containing what appeared to be a partial confession, though the signature had been carefully cut away. The document, dated June 22, 1845, just 2 days after Caldwell's death, reads, "I record these words not in remorse, but in recognition of what has been accomplished. For 14 months I have executed a plan of perfect justice. The master who owned others has been owned by his own hunger. The man who consumed the labor and lives of others has been consumed by his own appetites. Let it be known that his death was neither quick nor merciful, but a gradual surrender to the prison of flesh I constructed around him. On the final night, as he lay immobile on his specially built bed, I revealed to him the true nature of our arrangement. I showed him the journal where I had recorded every measurement, every increase in his girth, every new limitation in his movement. I read to him the recipes I had created specifically to ensure his body would fail while his hunger would only grow. I revealed the compounds from my homeland that had been part of every meal, binding him first to the pleasure of eating and then to me as the source of that pleasure. His eyes registered understanding, then fear, then a curious resignation. He asked why I had chosen this method rather than a swift poison or blade. I explained that there is no justice in a quick death, that true balance required him to experience the slow removal of his freedom, the gradual claiming of his dignity, the incremental surrender of his will to forces he could neither control nor resist. In those final hours, as I fed him the last meal he would ever consume, a rich custard containing the highest concentration yet of the substances that had been his undoing, he wept. Not, I think, from fear of death, but from the realization that he had been complicit in his own destruction, that every moment of indulgence had tightened the noose around his neck. I leave this record not in shame, but in completion. The scales now balance. The hunger is satisfied. This disturbing document disappeared from county records within days of its discovery. The clerk who found it reported being visited by 2 men claiming to be from the State Historical Society, who confiscated the document for proper preservation. No record of these individuals exists in the Society's employment history, and the document has never resurfaced in any archive. The most comprehensive attempt to piece together the Elmwood case came in 1987, when investigative journalist Robert Thornton began researching a book on unsolved historical crimes in the Deep South. Thornton spent months in Natchez, interviewing descendants of families connected to Elmwood, searching local archives, and attempting to track down the scattered documents related to the case. His research notebooks, donated to the University of Mississippi after his death in 2001, reveal that he had developed a detailed timeline of events and had begun to uncover what he believed was a broader pattern connecting Delilah Moore to similar cases throughout the South. Thornton had identified 3 other wealthy plantation owners who had died under similar circumstances between 1835 and 1855, all after employing a cook or housemaid whose description matched Delilah's. According to marginalia in Thornton's notebooks, he became convinced that Delilah Moore was not merely seeking personal revenge against Caldwell, but was part of a clandestine network of women from St. Domingue who had developed a systematic method of infiltrating wealthy households and eliminating their masters through this unique form of gastronomic assassination. Thornton's research took a disturbing turn in 1989, when he reported receiving anonymous packages containing small jars of unidentified food items and notes saying, "Taste and understand." He became increasingly paranoid about eating in restaurants or accepting food from others, believing he was being watched by descendants of the network he was investigating. The book Thornton had planned was never completed. In 1990, he abruptly abandoned the project, destroyed many of his notes, and left Natchez. When contacted by colleagues years later, he refused to discuss the Elmwood case, saying only, "Some appetites should not be fed, and some knowledge should not be consumed." His remaining notes contain a cryptic final entry. The method continues. They are still among us, watching for those whose hunger exceeds their wisdom. I have seen the evidence. I have tasted what they offer. May God forgive me for what I almost revealed. A curious artifact connected to the case surfaced in 2003 when an antique dealer in New Orleans acquired the contents of a storage unit whose rent had gone unpaid for decades. Among the items was a silver serving spoon, unusually heavy for its size, with the initials H.C. engraved on the handle and the date June 20, 1845, inscribed on the back of the bowl. When the dealer had the spoon appraised, the silversmith discovered that the bowl of the spoon had been specially modified. It contained a hidden compartment that could be accessed by twisting the handle in a particular way. Inside this compartment were traces of a reddish-brown substance that, when analyzed by a university laboratory, was found to contain compounds derived from plants native to Haiti, known for their effects on metabolism and cardiovascular function. The spoon was purchased by a private collector and has not been publicly displayed, but photographs and the laboratory report briefly circulated among researchers interested in the Elmwood case. The report concluded that the substance, if consumed regularly in small amounts, could create both physical dependency and significant physiological changes consistent with the symptoms described in Dr. Merriweather's journal. This artifact provides perhaps the most concrete evidence of the methods Delilah Moore may have employed, suggesting a level of premeditation and sophistication that elevates her actions from opportunistic poisoning to a carefully engineered form of revenge. In 2008, a professor of culinary anthropology at Tulane University, Dr. Josephine Moreau, published a paper analyzing historical recipes from the Caribbean and their adaptation in the American South during the 19th century. The paper made no direct reference to the Elmwood case, but described a tradition of ceremonial feeding in which the preparation and serving of food became a means of exerting control over those in positions of power. The intimacy of the feeding relationship, Dr. Moreau wrote, creates a unique opportunity for power inversion. The preparer of food literally places substances inside the body of the consumer, establishing a level of access and influence that transcends normal social boundaries. In certain traditions, this access was recognized as a potential weapon, a means by which those in seemingly powerless positions could exercise profound control over those who believed themselves invulnerable. Shortly after the paper's publication, Dr. Moreau reported receiving an anonymous package containing a small leather-bound book with no text, only pressed leaves and flowers from plants known in traditional Caribbean medicine. A note accompanying the book read simply, "The tradition continues. Speak no further." Dr. Moreau discontinued this line of research and has declined all interview requests regarding the Elmwood case. Perhaps the most eerie development in the case occurred in 2015, when a local Natchez restaurant began offering a special dessert called Elmwood custard, described as a rich traditional recipe rediscovered from the antebellum period. The custard quickly became popular among tourists and locals alike, with many reporting it was the most satisfying dessert they had ever tasted, creating a craving that brought them back repeatedly. The chef, when interviewed about the recipe's origin, claimed to have discovered it in an old family cookbook, though she was vague about specific details. The restaurant experienced unprecedented success, with customers often ordering multiple portions of the custard and reporting sensations of increased hunger even as they consumed it. After 3 months, several regular patrons began experiencing symptoms including water retention, shortness of breath, and unusual weight gain. A local doctor, familiar with the historical accounts of the Elmwood case, became suspicious and arranged for a sample of the custard to be analyzed. The results showed elevated levels of certain herbal compounds known to affect metabolism and create mild physical dependency. When confronted with these findings, the chef disappeared, leaving behind a kitchen wall on which was written, in what appeared to be burned sugar, "The feast never ends. The hunger never dies." The restaurant closed shortly thereafter, and efforts to locate the chef have been unsuccessful. This incident, while never conclusively linked to the historical case, suggests the disturbing possibility that knowledge of Delilah Moore's methods may continue to be passed down through generations, surviving in the shadows of culinary tradition. In 2018, during a historical preservation project at the former site of Elmwood, ground-penetrating radar revealed an anomaly beneath what would have been the kitchen floor of the main house. Excavation uncovered a small, sealed brick chamber containing a collection of artifacts. Several glass vials similar to those found in the restaurant wall in 2005, a mortar and pestle made of a distinctive stone from Haiti, and a leather-bound journal written in a combination of French, Creole, and English. The journal, currently held in a climate-controlled facility at the Mississippi Department of Archives and History, has been only partially translated due to its degraded condition and unusual dialect. The sections that have been deciphered appear to be a detailed record of Delilah Moore's time at Elmwood, including meticulous notes on Harold Caldwell's transformation. One particularly disturbing entry, dated approximately February 1845, reads, "The master now consumes triple the portions of 4 months ago, yet complains constantly of hunger that will not abate. His frame has expanded beyond recognition, and he can no longer descend the stairs without assistance. He is becoming the monument to excess I have designed, a physical manifestation of the moral corruption that defines his kind. Soon he will be entirely dependent on me for every need, every comfort, every morsel that passes his lips. In this way, the enslaved becomes the master, and the master becomes enslaved to his own appetites." This is justice administered one spoonful at a time. Another entry, apparently from the final days before Caldwell's death, contains a detailed description of what Delilah called the culmination, a 3-day feeding ritual designed to bring about final organ failure through a combination of massive overconsumption and carefully calibrated doses of various compounds. The clinical detachment with which this process is described contrasts sharply with a single sentence at the entry's conclusion. "As he consumed the final meal, I whispered in his ear the names of every person he had ever owned, ensuring he carried the weight of that knowledge with him into whatever judgment awaits." The journal also contains references to communication with others engaged in similar acts of resistance throughout the South, suggesting that Thornton's theory of a network might have had merit. Several passages mention correspondence with women in Charleston, Richmond, and New Orleans who were employing the method against other wealthy plantation owners. Most chilling is the journal's final entry, written apparently on the day of Delilah's departure from Elmwood. "The work here is complete, but the hunger for justice remains. Others will continue what I have begun in kitchens and dining rooms where power thinks itself secure. We move unseen among them, feeding them their own destruction. The recipe has been passed on. The tradition will not die. As long as there are those who feast while others starve, there will be those who understand the power of the spoon, the ladle, the serving dish. The feast never ends. The hunger never dies." The journal was scheduled for complete translation and digitization, but in 2019, a small fire broke out in the archive room where it was stored. While quickly contained, the fire damaged several documents, including most of the Elmwood Journal. Many researchers consider the timing suspicious, particularly given the pattern of evidence disappearing throughout the case's history. Dr. Eleanor Blackwood, the archivist who had been working on the journal's translation, resigned from her position shortly after the fire. In a brief statement to colleagues, she wrote, "There are some historical records that seem resistant to being fully brought to light. The Elmwood case has destroyed or diverted the careers of everyone who has looked too deeply into it. I've decided to focus my attention elsewhere, and I recommend others do the same." Despite this warning, interest in the case continues. Amateur historians, culinary anthropologists, and researchers of African American resistance traditions occasionally rediscover the fragmented story and attempt to piece together the complete narrative. Yet each effort seems to hit the same wall of missing evidence. mysterious discouragements, and inexplicable roadblocks. In 2022, the last known descendant of Harold Caldwell's family line died in Baltimore, leaving no heirs. In a curious bequest, she left funds for the maintenance of his grave in the Natchez City Cemetery and for the placement of a new headstone. The inscription she specified reads simply, Harold Caldwell, 1799–1845, consumed by his appetites. Cemetery records indicate that the new headstone was installed as directed, but visitors to the grave report that it has since been replaced with the original, simpler marker, with no record of who authorized the change. The grave itself has become something of a local legend. Visitors occasionally leave small food items, sugar cookies, pastries, or candies, as offerings or perhaps warnings. Groundskeepers report that regardless of when these items are placed, they are always gone by morning, with no evidence of animals or human disturbance. Perhaps most unsettling are the reports from several visitors who claim to have experienced vivid dreams after visiting the grave, dreams of endless feasts they cannot stop consuming, of hunger that grows with each bite rather than diminishing, of a woman standing in the shadows, watching with patient satisfaction as they eat themselves into immobility. These accounts are easily dismissed as the power of suggestion working on minds already familiar with the Elmwood legend. Yet they speak to the enduring power of the story, the way it touches something primal in our understanding of hunger, consumption, and the intimate power relationships embedded in the act of feeding and being fed. The tale of Delilah Moore and Harold Caldwell remains one of the most disturbing examples of resistance in the antebellum South, precisely because it operated within and exploited the expected roles assigned to both master and servant. It represents a form of rebellion so subtle, so aligned with the surface appearances of the existing order, that it remained invisible to the society in which it occurred. While many aspects of the case remain unverified or contradictory, the core narrative of a woman who weaponized her expected role as nourisher to systematically destroy her oppressor continues to resonate as a dark reminder of how power can be subverted in the most intimate of spaces. The historical record may never yield a complete or definitive account of what transpired at Elmwood Plantation in 1844–1845. Perhaps that uncertainty is fitting for a case centered on hidden ingredients, disguised intentions, and the shadowy space between nourishment and destruction. What remains clear is that in the relationship between Harold Caldwell and Delilah Moore, the traditional power dynamic of antebellum Mississippi was inverted through the most basic of human needs, hunger and its satisfaction. It stands as a grim reminder that control is often exercised in unexpected ways, and that true power sometimes resides not with those who give orders, but with those who serve what we consume. In the warm Mississippi nights, when the air hangs heavy with humidity and the sounds of insects create a constant backdrop, residents near the former site of Elmwood sometimes report a particular scent on the breeze, rich, sweet, inviting, yet with an underlying note that causes an inexplicable unease. It is the smell of something delicious being prepared by unseen hands, a feast that calls to something primal within us, even as a deeper instinct warns us to turn away. For in the story of Elmwood, the most terrifying truth may be that destruction often comes not as an obvious threat, but as something we welcome, something we crave, something we willingly consume until it consumes us in return. The documentary filmmaker Maya Rodriguez visited Natchez in 2020, intending to create a short film about the Elmwood case. After 2 weeks of research and interviews, she abruptly packed her equipment and left town, leaving behind a single note for her production assistant. "This story doesn't want to be told. I've lost my appetite for it." When contacted later about her experience, Rodriguez would only say, "Some histories resist documentation. This one seems to devour those who try to expose it." Perhaps the final word on the Elmwood case should go to Dr. James Merriweather, whose journal first documented the strange transformation of Harold Caldwell. In his last entry before leaving Natchez in 1845, he wrote, "I have been troubled by the question of whether I should have done more to intervene in Caldwell's decline. As a physician, I recognized the symptoms of his deterioration, yet I failed to fully comprehend the deliberate nature of what was occurring. I wonder now if this blindness was my own failing, or if it speaks to a larger truth about our society, that we are so accustomed to certain power relationships that we cannot recognize when they are being subverted before our eyes. Perhaps the most perfect crime is not one that leaves no evidence, but one that so perfectly aligns with our expectations that we cannot see it as a crime at all, even as it unfolds in plain sight." The feast at Elmwood ended in 1845, but the hunger for justice, for understanding, for the full truth continues. And in kitchens across the South, across America, across time itself, the preparation of food remains what it has always been, an act of intimate power, a daily ritual that can nourish or destroy, comfort or control. In the story of Delilah Moore and Harold Caldwell, we are reminded that this most basic of human interactions carries within it the potential for both sustenance and subversion, for both care and calculated revenge. The hunger never dies, the feast never ends, and somewhere perhaps Delilah Moore is still watching, still waiting, still measuring out justice one spoonful at a time.